We always say patch your software, but sometimes it's a little more complicated than that.
So Matt, I hear you have a Bluekeep story for us.
It's kind of a Bluekeep story, it's kind of a meltdown story, and it's also kind of a Metasploit story. So in the last couple of weeks or so, there's been an increase in scanning in Bluekeep. This half of this year, we've been talking about Bluekeep, we've been waiting for the other shoe to drop on people actually using it for like a worm or something crazy. Yeah. And as it turns out, in the last couple of weeks, people who are running honeypots, in particular, there's a guy, Kevin Beaumont, pretty well known on Twitter, who has been reporting that all of his honeypots have been crashing.
Oh no.
Yes, and they have been, they're waiting for the Bluekeep exploit, apparently. So people are starting to look into why are they crashing. Like scanning and exploitation we understand, but why are they crashing? And as it turns out, the guy who wrote the Metasploit module to attack Bluekeep, which is the one that's getting used right now in all sorts of crypto mining operations, people will use the exploit, get on the box, install crypto miner, right? The environment in which he developed it wasn't patched for Meltdown. Now, Meltdown is a speculative execution bug from like 2018, 2017.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not really old news, but it's certainly not new news anymore.
No,
and
it is big news.
And as it turns out, the mitigation that they put in place is not something that the developers of Metasploit tested with. So when you put these two things together, you end up crashing that system. And it turns out this kernel virtual address shadow, KVA shadow, is the mitigation they put in place. And it is much more complicated than even I can express correctly. And the guy who found the bug actually did a nice write-up about it. But as it turns out, what they're doing is they're protecting certain memory from user land. So like you can access certain kernel functions, but not all of them, and that's a very good thing that that's possible. But the code that they wrote in order to exploit Bluekeep doesn't account for that. So the code gets into an infinite loop, and eventually that process goes down. And I think because we're working in the kernel space, that means everything goes down. I think.
Makes sense.
It makes sense. Okay, good. What's going to have to happen now, and it seems like a weird thing to say, is that we've got this problem, and the solution is to update the Metasploit exploit to make it more correct, right? Because
that's a weird sentence.
It's a weird sentence because you're like, but wait, I realize people use Metasploit for very good reasons in pen testing, but then again, bad guys take the Metasploit modules, drop it into their malware, and use it for bad. So do you want a working exploit that everyone can use, or do you want an exploit that doesn't always work? That also crashes things, right? So it's a weird space to saying what should be done in general. Yeah, they should fix the module because at least you won't have widespread internet machines getting crashed even when they're patched. I think that's the big thing, is that even when you do the right thing and your machine is patched, you're still vulnerable because of the way that the Metasploit module was written. And it's not your fault, but you're still vulnerable.
So the trouble is, when you've patched for Meltdown, then the module will actually crash your system. So that's certainly a lot better than if you're not patched for Meltdown, and then the module actually is able to exploit your system successfully. But crashing it is still a pretty bad thing.
I think the best thing for people is to not have RDP exposed to the internet.
Yes, and that's where I was going next.
I think that's the root of the problem, for sure.
So if you can take it offline, absolutely, make sure it's offline.
But there are legitimate purposes for remote desktop services, so.
Yeah, there are. I personally am of the opinion that people exposing things like RDP should also have a layer of VPN around the outside.
Yeah, agreed.
Just that way it's not like a couple packets and you're toast.
Yeah.
You still have to get past that outer layer.
Not a door just
You
sitting
can also have access control lists, firewall entries to allow only specific blocks to be able to enter. Even if you're getting your IP address from, let's say, your ISP, they usually have a range of DHCP addresses that they allow in. So you might allow those in, or there might be other protections.
And I keep thinking back to a couple years back, we were talking more about like ATM malware or RDP into like a restaurant system where someone is managing a restaurant remotely and they're all using RDP for that. And it's not always a very sophisticated setup. Like it might just be, we put a box on the internet and we opened up RDP because that's what we needed, So yeah, there's always ways to protect against this sort of stuff. Some more involved than others, but generally the more involved, the better.
The more layered, probably.
That's probably a better way of saying it.
The more layered, the better.
Just not make it complex for the sake of complexity.
Yes.
We're not going to build a labyrinth just because we think it makes it a little more hard.
Vulnerability researchers always impress me.
Yeah.
I believe this specific vulnerability, the way to exploit it is like a use after free or something like that, which by itself is really esoteric to try to figure out, like, how do you actually exploit that? So kudos to the researcher who wrote the module. But then the fact that bad guys are able to just take it and crash a bunch of computers, well, maybe that's a wake-up call to some admins to say, hey, why is my machine crashing? Maybe is everything up to date? Even if they don't realize that there's this vulnerability going on out there, perhaps it will trigger something to say, hey, my hardware is out of date or my software is out of date. Maybe I should just patch this whole thing or come up with a different scheme.
But on the flip side, this is happening regardless, like if you're patched correctly. Like you're doing the right thing, and then the exploit comes by and still manages to crash you.
Is it the meltdown patch and so are you supposed to be patched for meltdown and for Bluekeep, and still happens?
That's, yeah.
Or is it that if you're just patched for one and not the other, you get the crash? Do you recall?
So my understanding is when the guy wrote the exploit, he tested it. It was a successful exploit against the Bluekeep vulnerability in an environment that was not patched
for meltdown.
When you patch for meltdown and you patch for Bluekeep,
it still crashes.
That's when you crash. If you're not patched for meltdown, the exploit code works without side effects.
And if we're having this much trouble.
Right. It is a little confusing.
It is a little confusing.
It is.
So then, imagine what it is out there. So again, this is why I think we have to depend on layered security always.
And I would never say to somebody, don't patch because of this. I would say patch and keep an eye on stuff and close your darn ports if you don't need them open. I mean, minimize the effect that you possibly can have.
As always, you should patch your systems, but I think the real issue here is going to be exposing RDP to the internet, which is almost never a good idea. RDP over the internet can be useful, obviously for remote administration, but leaving RDP services just sitting on the internet is not generally a good idea. You want to put it behind an access control list, put it around VPN or some sort of mitigating steps to disallow anybody on the internet to knock on the door, so to speak, of your remote desktop.